province, we've been engaged very actively in getting our provincial development convention going, and social cohesion is a key element of that whole process, and social compacting. And so today we're hosting this seminar series as part of our process of getting to, as a research institution, getting to understand key issues and key challenges, so that ultimately we can come up with some very good solutions to those challenges. And as I said, we are building on the success of the provincial development conference, and today we've got a very, very special guest with us. We've got Dr. Candice Morkel. Candice is currently the director of CLEAR APP. She's based at the University of Witswatersrand, but Candice is well known to most of us in the province. It's almost like a homecoming. She's been working in government for quite some time. She's got extensive experience. And I think if you start working in M&E in this province and you ask around for technical advice, I can almost guarantee you at some point somebody's going to say, guys, you need to phone Candice Morkel because she's the expert in the field. So Candice, we are really, really honored to have you here today, and we are really looking forward to your discussions. Colleagues, just some quick house rules before I formally let Candice speak. First of all, I think for us, all of us, this is a learning space where we disseminate information and we learn. So it's a safe space. Please feel free to ask your questions, raise your opinions. This is really, really a free space. The program will basically, I'll hand over to Candice in the next couple of minutes. She will then present till about 2:30. And at that point, she will then open up the floor. She did tell me her presentation may sound very formal, but we're having a conversation. So afterwards, colleagues, I'll allow you and I'll recognize you. And if you have a question, and then if you do have a question, please just identify yourself and the organization that you are from. So colleagues, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Morkel. Candice, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sybert, and hello, everybody. As I was saying to Sybert earlier on, it certainly feels like being home. I worked in the Eastern Cape Office of the Premier for about 8 years. I worked very closely with ECSECC, of course, especially with Siv, whom, of course, all of you know very well. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful that you're giving me this space to share my thoughts with you. Of course, there are some external people here as well. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. I hope we'll be able to have an engaging conversation, as Sybert indicated, after I presented some of my thoughts with you. And I'm going to quickly share, give me a second. I think admin will have to just take down the agenda slide. And I have a couple of slides that I can show while I'm talking. And I don't know if you have to stop sharing, Zwanga, for me to do that. Okay, wonderful. And so even though it's a little bit formal or theoretical, I really hope that we're able to talk, very casually after I've presented my thoughts to you. So this topic grabbed my attention ever since I did my PhD a couple of years ago, focusing specifically on the relationship between the National Department of Social Development and the NPO sector in relation to the Developmental Social Welfare Mandate. So although it was very specific to that relationship, I believe that the topic in general holds great value for today's broader discussion on social compacting between the state and non-state actors. So part of diving into a topic like this is about unpacking definitions. What do we mean exactly by the state? Who are these non-state actors we're talking about? What are developmental states? What is social compacting? So I really appreciate this quote by Laxi, who remarked about 6 decades ago that not a little of the barrenness of political philosophy is due to the failure of men to agree upon the meaning of their terms. So the challenge, of course, in presenting definitions and sketching a contextual framework is that invariably it's going to present only a partial picture, and it will obscure the complexity of the subject because I have to be so brief. There are also obviously risks that my presentation reveals my own personal posture from an ontological and axiological perspective. What I mean is that what I consider to be a reality and the values that I hold rather than an objective reality. So I really do encourage you to think critically, consider the views I'm presenting to you today, and let's hopefully engage during the discussion portion of the session. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about the state? Many scholars have agreed that the concept has remained spectacularly unclear. It's an elusive and contested subject. It's controversial and disputed. So many definitions of the state really almost always rely on a structural functional approach, meaning that it's the institutions that make up the state, or alternatively, the role and the functions that it plays. So no matter whether you agree with him or not, we do have a Weberian dominance. So Max Weber was a German sociologist, and he has been the point of departure for so many theorists on the state. And therefore, the dominant conception of the state remains the existence of a bureaucracy and the monopoly of the use of physical violence, coercion, or force. So generally, a definition of the state incorporates a couple of common key features. One of them, that it's not simply the government or a regime. It comprises a number of things, such as, for example, a geographical territory, a population that's not part of another territory, predictable rules and laws, etc., etc. But what I really like and what I really feel is important for our discussion today is Nikos Poulantzas' definition of the state, that the state is relational. That is, it is co-constituted by its relations with society. So the contemporary democratic state is therefore inextricably linked to society, such that any analysis of the state cannot be done in isolation from the society it governs. So I think this sets us up very nicely to start defining the developmental state. So there's extensive research in this area, but it also still remains nebulous. I think it's just political scientists who and public administration scholars who are contesting the various definitions. I'll come back to the notion of a capable and ethical developmental state a bit later. I've got a personal contestation with it being a bit superfluous. I do think that those descriptors are fundamental preconditions or characteristics of the developmental state, but I'll come back to why I say so a little bit later. So we see a couple of elements of these definitions coming out in so many scholars, and I'll just mention two, or they're there on the screen. A developmental state is a state that puts economic development as the top priority of governmental policy and is able to design effective instruments to promote such a goal. Similarly, it is the ability to promote and sustain development, understanding by development meaning the combination of steady high rates of economic growth and structural change in the productive system, both domestically and in its relationship to the international economy. So there are many, many more definitions following basically the same pattern. What's important about this is that the definition, or the orthodox definition of the developmental state, is really traditionally associated with high economic growth, such that the mission of the developmental state is to achieve such economic growth. And historically, this has been through, of course, industrial policy. But we also know from the South African narrative that the developmental state is one whose purpose it is to ensure that it is involved in economic activity, but it must support both social and economic development goals. Following this economic growth argument, developmental states therefore have traditionally been associated with strong relations between the private sector and government, such that the state provides an enabling environment within which private capital may thrive. But this is a very limited view of a definition of a developmental state, and it's been questioned by a number of scholars. And more heterodox views recognize that economic growth is not the most salient indicator of development. And so our traditional notions of who the state must have these close relations with, and primarily being the private sector, it has come under scrutiny. So Peter Evans, in a seminal work entitled Embedded Autonomy, States and Industrial Development, gave us a shift in our thinking about this particular topic and really provided the impetus for considering a different set of state-society relations in the pursuit of developmental states. So Peter Evans offered that states may require a similarly close relationship with non-traditional, non-state actors, and he specifically mentioned labor and civil society. Omano Edigeji also argued, in fact, that a country's economic performance relies on its relations between the state and such societal institutions. So Evans really opened up this new thinking around the need for more transformative ways of thinking about developmental states and what social compacting should look like. So these more transformative views on building developmental states emerged from this rising consensus that development includes the well-being of people. It's not just about economic growth. And therefore, civil society and labor, and not only industrial elites, are critical partners in designing and implementing national development strategies. So coming to social compacting, quite a big social compacting seminar was held in South Africa in July last year, hosted by the Anglophone Trust. And some of you may be very familiar with the Anglophone scenarios, which in sketching potential future realities for South Africa combines both intuitive logic plus a robust evidence base. So at this seminar, Lisa Septal, the Executive Director of South Africa's National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, quoted Mistra's definition of social compacting, which I think is very, very helpful and relevant for our discussion today. And they say social compacting has the attributes of a core agreement among various societal role players and their government that outlines the rights and duties of each party. So nice and simple, nice and easy to understand. So the expansion of the societal groups that engage in a close relationship with the state, which would lead to a more politically robust and adaptive version of what Evans calls embedded autonomy, and I'll get to the definition of that in a moment, is a very, very important shift in the discourse on the orthodox views of the developmental state. This is also possibly, in my opinion, where some of the contestation lies in the bifurcation between social and economic policy. For some, it's contested because, a lot of people say that South Africa has a very strong social floor. We have very high investment in health and education, but we also do have a very strong focus on economic policy and economic growth objectives. So that might be something we can talk about a bit later. So this embedded autonomy that Peter Evans talks about is what I'd like to discuss in the context of social compacting and this transformative shift in the thinking about the nature of the state-society relationship in building a developmental state. So embedded autonomy is, in short, a state that is sufficiently embedded in a relationship of trust and intimacy with a broad set of non-state actors, yet remains autonomous and unfettered by private interests. I want to specify and specifically point out this shift away from the focus of the relationship with the private sector, which is your orthodox traditional version of developmental states, the ability to discipline private sector and so forth, and turn our attention to the key argument, which is that a state that is sufficiently embedded in this intimate autonomous relationship with this broad set of non-state actors is more likely to achieve its development goals. We can go further and state that embedded autonomy is actually an important precondition to building a capable developmental state. So ECSECC, of course, is perfectly suited to be having this discussion today, as it was founded specifically to foster meaningful partnerships between the key stakeholders of the Eastern Cape province. So social compacting, I could say, is in ECSECC's DNA, but what should this look like in a developmental state? Let's have a look at embeddedness as the first part of this precondition. What we're talking about here is not a simple, amicable, collegial relationship between the state and its stakeholders. We're talking about dense internal ties and exchanges between the state and society, represented by organized formations, where stakeholders' powers are actually incorporated into the state. So, a couple of characteristics of embeddedness that Peter Evans gives us. He refers it to as a concrete set of social ties. He refers to the binding of the state both intimately and aggressively to society. He talks about the provision of institutionalized channels that allow for continuous negotiation over development goals and policies. And I think this has particular relevance for the work that ECSECC is doing. In particular, for example, the Development Convention that Sybert mentioned earlier on, it's one of those institutional channels that I believe, feeds into this particular characteristic. And then also more radically, Evans talks about the contestation between the public-private divide. If we think about the Weberian state, for example, it is very focused on this division between the public and private spheres, that, you need to have very autonomous bureaucracy that's able to deliver services. But now here we have this very transformative thinking saying we've got to contest that, and we need to place a higher value in trust as well as productive informal network. So I want to underscore this issue of trust in embeddedness because it's really crucial in binding society together in a joint project of moral and social order anchored in a dynamic civil society. And when you hear civil society, as I'm speaking today, I'm meaning broad civil society. I'm including all non-state actors, labor, academia, and so forth. So not only does Evans emphasize the importance of what he terms the state-society synergy, but he also emphasizes with whom, because he's trying to pull us away from this emphasis on the private sector. So he offers that development success will increasingly depend on the state's ability to build intimate ties with civil society from the bottom up. There is a tacit understanding that an enduring form of social capital is created when the state and this broad base of non-state actors work together in collaboration. So conceptualizing this issue of intimacy and trust sounds very much like we're talking about collegial relationships between people, but it's important for us to illuminate what is meant by these close relations in terms of the state and society and how it relates to collaboration and co-production. So although the feeling of trust is connected to intimacy, it's not about merely the complementarities that exist between the state and non-state formations. We must also distinguish between the trust between individual citizens and the state and the trust that exists between organized formations and the state. So there were a couple of studies done in South Africa around how South African society feels about the state or about the bureaucracy, about government. And it's come out as being, there are dire cracks, I think, in that relationship, and that the feelings of trust of citizens towards the state. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about this relationship. We're talking about organized formations. And it's about the trust required between the co-producers of public goods. So if you think about, for example, community development workers or social workers or healthcare workers, and who are embedded in local communities, and maybe faith-based organizations, non-profit organizations, and how they're working together with, for example, the social sector. So according to Granovetter, trust is relational. Of course, I think that is sort of obvious to us. But what is needed is a set of concrete connections between the state and its non-state stakeholders, which provide the basis for trust to develop. So this intimacy and this deep connectedness, however, needs to be balanced by autonomy. So we can't have this entire kumbaya, very organic, open, intimate relationship between the state and society. It still has a bureaucratic mandate. There are certain, I think there's always going to be a hybridity between the Weberian conceptualization of the state and sort of machine-based state functions where the machinery of the state has to work, while at the same time it needs to make sure it has these close, intimate relations with society. So that contestation and that tension will always be there. And this autonomy, or that's the second part of the precondition, which in embedded autonomy is the autonomy bit, is the ability of states to act independently without undue external influence. So this is now really important, and I'll come to some of the critiques against autonomy in a moment, and why there is a very strict need in developmental states to balance embeddedness with autonomy. But state autonomy, or how it unfolds in the many actions the state takes, reveals much about whose interests are being protected. And I think that's a very important point. So the critique or the criticism against autonomy is that there is a very high likelihood that states in possession of excessive autonomy will use it in ways that are detrimental to its citizens. And this maximization of autonomy is a natural phenomenon in modern democratic states, whereby officials often shape the state into a self-interested and powerful actor. So the specialized capacity of the state, if you think about a function such as policing, also give it the legitimacy to pursue its own interests. And if it is completely isolated or insulated from any non-state formations or society in general, it could actually fall into predatory behavior. That's why I stated earlier that I have an issue actually about the need to explicitly call a developmental state a capable and ethical developmental state. In my opinion, that a true developmental state will temper embeddedness with autonomy and vice versa. The criticism leveled against embedded autonomy is that the close ties that develop between the state and any non-state actor replaces one set of elites with another. So here we are criticizing, the state's relationship with private sector, saying that it's creating a set of elites, and we need to get, hegemony from below and make sure that citizens and civil society feel included or are included in decision-making and in co-production of public goods together with the state. But there's a theory that it just creates another set of elites. So in predatory states, the connections that officials and representatives of the state have with communities are really actually based on personal relationships. So it's not a true embeddedness. It's not about the relation between the state as a collective and its constituencies. It's all about those personal relations, and that is what must be cautioned against. So rather than using these connections for the pursuit of collective goals, these ties and connections are used for personal gain. They may also lean towards authoritarianism, alienate non-state stakeholders in policy processes, and ultimately fail at achieving economic development outcomes. So those are all the critiques, against autonomy. And like I said, the balance between embeddedness and autonomy are really important. Before I get to the capable developmental state, let me just talk a little bit about intimacy and influence and access and expanding the way the state relates to non-state actors or broader social formations. I think what's important is that the state needs to pay attention to even greater levels of inclusiveness and accountability in consultation and decision-making to prevent elite capture, which is why the work, for example, of ECSECC in the Development Convention and the other kind of stakeholder engagements is so important, because that is what actually cautions against this overly either embedded or overly autonomous state. So the appropriate way in which autonomy should be deployed is for states to engage deeply with a multiplicity of social actors who are similarly transformative in their outlook, and to build that balance between embeddedness and autonomy to further the goals of the developmental state. So in order to ensure that there's, predatory states don't develop, we need to ensure that they aren't completely insulated states, and this balance is important. Coming to the important point about the capable developmental state, and I said earlier on, that is why I don't often think the descriptors are necessary, but be that as it may, I'm not the final word on it. Maybe it just kind of signals the importance of capability and capacity when one foregrounds that word. We must realize that beyond embeddedness and autonomy, the competence of the bureaucratic machinery is actually the fulcrum around which service delivery results are achieved. So state capacity is actually the cure for predatory states. It fosters the ability of the state to act coherently, reining in individual greed as well as an entrepreneurial posture to development for the common good. The ability of the state to act coherently and the robustness of the state apparatus are key levers in its relationship with civil society. So Evans actually states that the deterioration of state institutions is likely to go hand in hand with the disorganization of civil society. And I think this is a very important point, because we often laying, a lot of responsibility at the hands of non-state actors such as civil society, social justice organizations, to say you've got to bring the hegemony from below to, counteract, some of the challenges that we have in the state. But the theory states that actually the disorganization of state institutions creates disorganization in civil society as well. So you actually need both to be functioning at high capacity. So what is state capacity exactly? For developmental states in particular, Evans offers the following characteristics. He talks about, firstly, meritocratic recruitment, reward systems and incentives linked to the sustained pursuit of collective goals, complemented by predictable career paths and long-term rewards for bureaucrats, both of which help to generate a sense of corporate coherence. Second characteristic is bureaucratic coherence. About 10 years later, he added on its bureaucratic coherence, but also democratically deliberative institutions. Because I think this is where the realization was that, well, you can have bureaucratic coherence, but you can have a dictatorial state that's all about the machinery and not have any kind of democratic consideration. So I think that's 10 years later, he sort of added this on. And this should be in a democratic developmental state where co-production can thrive. And then lastly, he talks about a solid and sophisticated state apparatus. So weak state capacity and the growing reliance on non-state partnerships are also linked to the development of predatory states and neo-patrimonialism. So actually, if you've got a weak state or weak state capacity, you actually have a high risk of state capture by political elites. And it's one of the greatest risks facing developmental states. I talk here about Gramsci's concept of hegemony. So not to get too tied up with that. The basic principle I'm trying to say here is that it's a useful analytical tool. It helps us to understand and dissect how civil society may provide a counterbalance to this risk. So what are we actually saying? We're saying that civil society in its broadest sense represents the potential to establish a system of checks and balances which may protect the needs and interests of ordinary citizens. But the mere existence of civil society organizations or social formations doesn't necessarily resolve our problem of the hegemony of the elite, because civil society itself is a vector, or could be the vector, of prevailing consensuses around a dominant set of interests and values. What do I mean by that? If there's a dominant set of interests that prevail within the context, civil society formations, if they're not strong enough and independent enough, they will just be vectors of that. They will just assimilate those, and they will just reproduce the same patterns of elitism and elite capture within those social formations, which I think is a really, really important point when we talk about who do we, and especially as ECSECC, I think, who do we foreground, who do we give voice to, amongst our social formations in this strong relationship with the state. So the interests of the working class and the spearheaded by an active citizenry and a strong, cohesive, capacitated and organized civil society, which is able to act as a resisting force to the hegemony that produces social inequality and provide a counter-hegemonic alternative that protects the rights of citizens. So civil society must take hold of the intellectual and moral leadership. I stated here, I'm a little bit early with my slide, but I think it's important. It's an important point. And as I was going through this and reading through some of the documents that the presidency, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation has put out, I've got the opportunity. Actually, at the moment, our organization is on the reference group for the development of the new medium-term strategic framework. And in there, of course, they've been looking at the Anglophone scenarios. They've been talking about, some of the challenges that exist. And they've been talking about social compacting. Obviously, the State of the Nation address last year, I think, was highlighted that. I think it was quite strong about social compacting. So we know a lot. We know all of this. I'm not presenting anything new to you today, maybe just in a new way. Maybe one of the two things are a bit new or nuanced. So we know a lot, but is it enough for us to know, to dialogue and engage? Or are we at the risk of pontification and self-reflection? Are we not yet seeing any progress because we, that analysis paralysis, we really, if you look at how we've conceptualized what social compacting is, and I just want to quote again NEDLAC's 28th annual summit held in September this year. The executive director remarked that South Africa was in the middle of an existential crisis, saying that we do not agree on the systemic long-term program to turn the economy around. We do not have the same economic view for the future, and that makes it difficult to have the big trade-off. But because we are in a polycrisis, that shouldn't stop us from continuing to build understanding and trust, responding to key issues, representing the best interests of your constituencies, especially in the context of adversity. So all of these things, even if you look at the Anglophone scenarios 2030, before the one that they're doing now for 2035, The key driving forces is the same stuff I've been presenting today. It's resistance, resentment, and reconciliation. That's the first driving force. The second one, institutional capacity and leadership. The third one, social inequality. If you look at the new scenarios, it's a little bit nuanced. They talk about the low economic growth trap, but basically it's saying the same stuff. And the indicators that we are measuring, it's the stuff that I've been talking about today. Shared sense of history, trust in institutions, state capacity, governance, accountability, civil society, amongst others. So this is not new. So I want us to engage perhaps in a conversation around why is this progress so slow? And I've got some questions for us all to answer, perhaps as a way of stimulating this discussion. And maybe first to ECSECC or to anybody. Do we have any good examples of social compacting that demonstrates the kind of embedded autonomy that Peter Evans proposes? And then what kinds of mechanisms do we need to develop the kind of trust, intimacy, and solidarity balanced with autonomy and a healthy constructive partnership that allows for co-production between the state and non-state constituencies, such as organized labor, civil society, academia, and so forth? At this point, thank you so much for your time, for listening to me. I know it's a long time to listen to somebody talk, but hopefully you got some new or interesting information. And I'd like to hand over to the chair and trust we can spend some time now engaging on these and other questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Chair. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morkel. It was really, really good. A really, really exciting presentation. It's always refreshing to come back to theory, to understand the theory, to understand the concepts, because we sometimes take things for granted. So thank you very much for that overview, and thank you for quoting Gramsci. I've been quite a fan of him. Colleagues, thank you very much. Colleagues, as we said in the beginning, this is a fantastic learning opportunity. I'm going to throw the floor open, and then as I acknowledge you, please just state where you're from and the question you want to pose to Dr. Morkel or to the group as a whole. So if I don't see you for some reason, please feel free to jump in when there is a gap. And for the colleagues that joined us a bit later, welcome everyone to this session. Colleagues, can I see if you could just raise your hands in the meeting platform, and then we can proceed with any questions or points of verification that you need from your side. I think whilst the colleagues are maybe thinking, Candice, maybe to get the debate going, we, with the exception of what we've been doing at ECSECC now in terms of the Development Convention and what's happening in the Eastern Cape, are you aware of any other examples where this kind of processes, where there's been really good workable social compacts? Maybe if you can refer to something local and maybe something more from a global perspective. Thank you.
Sorry, I was finding my mute button. Yeah, that's a really hard question, and I'm hoping that some other colleagues would also assist here. I think the basic one we all default to, our first one, is of course our constitution. So that is also, assumed to be a social compact. I think a lot of the agreements that came out of things like the job summits and so forth, one could also say that those are social compacts. But I think the key thing and the key challenge that I have is it's really been a broad base of citizens and broad base of civil society that's been approached and enlisted in a very deep, intimate, engaged relationship with the state in producing those things. I mean, it's also about whose voices get privileged in these spaces. And I think that there is a tendency for us to have, the usual suspects sometimes in some of these conventions where we do have these agreements set up. I also don't want to say that nothing's been happening. I think government's been quite good in, having these conversations. Like there was a social sector summit last year. But interestingly, again, I guess that's the difficulty of democratic deliberative institutions. You can't get to everybody. You have to have representation. And I guess that is ECSECC's challenge as well. You've got a limited scope, or not scope, I would say, but limited resources. And just in terms of the practicality of it, you cannot go to every single citizen. So you've got to depend on the organization of civil society for them, for us as civil society to be organizing ourselves. So you're assuming that if you've got those representatives there and their voices are being heard and that social compact is being developed, that represents, citizens' perspectives. But if you look at the data that's coming through on the surveys, the citizen surveys, and I think Anglophone Trust also did one recently for the new scenarios, it showed a complete breakdown in trust between citizens and the state. So whose voices are then being represented? Because the websites are amazing. I mean, if you go to these websites, I'm so proud to be a South African citizen, because it's like, yes, we're saying all the right things, but something is just not gelling. And what is it?
Thank you very much for that. I see there has been a request for us to share the presentation afterwards. I think we'll definitely do that. There's some really good references in there as well for those who want to read up a little bit more and proceed further. Colleagues, can I just see, is there anybody else that has a question or point that you want to raise? I see Ian Assam. Ian, please proceed.
Very good afternoon, Dr. Morkel. Very nice to see you again. Maybe let's just, as an introductory salvo, just if you can just speak a little bit more about sort of the necessary and sufficient conditions for social compacting, if you can, because I think that also is part of where the problems exist, is that when we conflate the two. Well, okay, let me not preclude an answer or give an answer, but just talk about the difference, subtle and wide, about the necessary and sufficient conditions. I think that's also instructive for me about understanding exactly what goes right and what goes wrong in South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a hard question. And thanks, Ian. And for those who don't know, Ian used to be my boss back in the day. So it's great to see you again, Ian. So yeah, I'm going to talk about it in terms of specifically preconditions for developmental states and embedded autonomy, because for me that's really linked. And it's around the trust between social formations and representing the desires, the demands, the needs of citizens and the state. And it's about having these solid opportunities which involve citizens or these social formations in planning in the state, for example, and prioritization. And an example of this is the new MTSF process, right? So there are about 30 of us as organizations representing various non-state actors in this reference group. But again, as I said earlier on, it's the usual suspects, and it's, quite an elite group of organizations and people who are involved, who are meant to be contributing to the state's program of planning for the next 5 years. And that's meant to be the co-production piece. But it's not through co-production and not true intimacy, and not a true compact, I would say, between citizens and the state, because it's not a truly broad-based grouping of people, of social formations enlisted in the deep work of planning going forward. Now, here's the contestation for me. What is sufficiency? Like, where's that line of sufficiency? It's a very difficult question to answer, because if our state is leaning towards a particular definition of a developmental state, which means a strong state, a state that's able to rein in and discipline non-state actors, which is the traditional definition of a developmental state, and it leans towards that, then it will make the decision about who it will include in its processes of planning. If it is leaning towards a more open state that truly believes in forging close relations with citizens and a people-centered state, then it will open up that space for democratic deliberation around what must go into the next MTSF. Now, granted, I'm outside of government for a very long time, of the South African government, and so maybe there are those processes happening at local government level, and maybe it's feeding upwards somehow. Please do correct me if I'm wrong in assuming that there aren't those spaces. But as far as I know, as a citizen, I don't know any other spaces where, there is this opportunity, formal opportunity for citizens to be providing inputs to long-range planning for the state. So for me, the issue around sufficiency and necessary conditions, if we're going to talk about embedded autonomy, we're talking here about that kind of intimacy or that kind of openness of the state. So yeah, that's what I can say for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Candice, colleagues, are there any questions? I think I don't want to be, I think I've got Andile. Andile, do you want to proceed? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Dr. Morkel. It's been some time. It's quite a menu. You've given us so much. I'm actually not sure where to start, but I'll just pick up a few, maybe two. And the first one is that I like the fact that you referred to the relation or trust relationship, not that being trust between the state and individuals, but organized social formations. I like that point quite a lot because this is where we started with, as we're organizing the Development Convention. This is the recognition that we made that actually the mistrust between state and social formations is actually an antithesis of what we want to achieve, social compacting, social cohesion. And I would like to just qualify social cohesion here and say progressive social cohesion, because you could have all sorts that will not actually help you. So I like that point quite a lot. And I want to bring closer to that and your opinion about the state of civil society. Because I think maybe not, let me not just ask a question, let me just express this opinion that I have from my observation, is that you had over time the civil society's strength dwindling and therefore weakening the voice of civil society, and therefore them not making a meaningful contribution in strengthening the state, but also in advancing the interests of society. So it's a very important aspect for me, because you have a lot of contestation in that space, and I think there's a huge role of money in the space of civil society, especially those organized formations which are largely funded by government. You would find that they are the most closer to the people. And you would have those that would represent particular interest, those that have a lot of money, money to the extent of taking government and standing toe-to-toe with government in the court of law. So I'm raising this complexity around civil society and its role in really strengthening it, because when you have this strong contradiction or contestation, that actually contributes to the strength of the capacity of the state in a relational form. So I'm raising this issue, this complexity around the dynamics around civil society organizations that exist there. Probably your opinion would be very much critical in this. But the second point related to that, but I would not belabor that too much, but it relates to organized labor as well. Over time, organized labor has been dwindling itself. The fact that you have multiple of these organized labor federations and this and that, it actually weakens the voice of labor in the context of social compacting, if you like, but also uniting the voice of the workers in holding even government accountable when it relates to matters of labor. So those two are very critical. But the last point as you were raising Gramsci, I just got reminded of Paulo Freire, especially on issues of conscientization, in ensuring that civil society and general citizenry its consciousness is raised to a level where in and themselves are able to voice their opinions. Currently, I do think that we have a passive citizenry, which does not help much. And what would be those tenets that could help us to really take this conscientization project off the ground, so that you have a citizenry that is quite active, but is also aware and conscious of what are the issues that they need to take up. For now, let me just stop there. And thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. Thank you very much.
Dr. Morkel, before you respond, I just want to check. I see Mr. Musana, who's our CEO, had raised his hand. Mr. Musana, I just want to check, is there a point that you still want to raise?
Thanks a lot, Sybert. Thanks a lot, Candice. Good to see you again. It's been quite a lot of years since you left the province. I think I'm covered by basically what Andile asked. But I, as you were saying, Sybert, that it's good to always go back to theory to understand our foundational basis of what we're talking about. And I think I like exactly what you have raised in terms of reference to the various thought leaders in the space. But there's just one seminal work that I find, and probably this is a limitation in me in terms of my philosophical outlook, which is the Marxist-Leninist approach and the different phases of that particular theoretical basis, both and out into the post-Marxist theorists around the state. And the major point being viewing and understanding the state as an instrument of change. And unfortunately, the alignment being a major issue of contestation, and which in most instances, at particular times, the class dominances do put themselves to where it would be serving the instrumentalist role. And to think about the context of a developmental state and how we took the evolution of developmental states and understood them, and where we currently have not been able to fully practice, particularly in countries that have had very strong Marxist, Leninist orientation, it really begs me a question. And the question being, what are the real core challenges? Because you would have had in those countries what you could easily say state and institutions of the state that are greatly class aligned, and in this instance, I would say working class particularly. And you find them with a number of failures. And the point is, would it be that the capture of the state, which we have, probably vulgarized in the South African context quite a lot, but also did that vulgarization because we were dealing with a particular context. But the capture generally of the state by oligarchies in other instances is something that we have also been seeing. And could it be that the shifts rather in ideological, and there's a very interesting comment made in a funeral this past weekend, that, you know, ideological clarity and sternness and content doesn't really beat drums when it leaves anyone. It just, you know, evaporates. But some of the key components of what makes those shifts is that our interests evolve with our own societal development and growth in society. So the point I'm trying to raise in respect of that, could it be that these shifts that we see, because we haven't seen since the Asian tigers, you know, major evolutions of developmental states that are able to drive the instrumentalist role for the benefit, you know, of change and benefit of everyone, ending the working class in particular. That's just one comment in passing. The second point is, I think one of the newer theories that are emerging, and I was listening and hoping we would take a bit of Mariana's, mission states, entrepreneuring states. You did talk about entrepreneuring states a bit, but in it and in the compacting with all of the different, societal constituencies or stakeholders, could it be that the co-creating of the vision and the futures that we have to converge on is something that the state must really preoccupy itself at every component of its work? Which brings me to the point. The reorientation of bureaucracy, particularly in newer developmental states or what's the right word? Those that are aspirant, because I would want to think that we still at a very high theoretical level in aspirant work. Couldn't be that one of the missions should really be able to deal with bureaucracy? Because the design of the bureaucracies, I think, in one book of the late Professor Plachis, both David Everett and one of our former planning commissioners, that's the name? Okay, that doesn't matter. But they raised the point very sharply that unfortunately bureaucracies by design are militaristic in the first instance, and therefore they have the limitation therefore not to be able to fulfill a very critical part of any state, which is being integrative. So if then bureaucracies work on the basis of militaristic lines, and as well as on the basis of silos, wouldn't be that we need to dedicate time and resources in actually helping bureaucracies themselves to transform, in readying themselves for this aspirant mission of building a developmental state. And in this instance, then taking the newer theories of mission states, taking the newer theories of entrepreneuring states as part of that. Thanks.
Dr. Morkel, please respond.
Thank you so much. Those are really wonderful insights, both from Mr. Mosana and Mr. Fikisi. I've got to stop getting excited when I hear from old colleagues. Truly is feeling like I'm home. I'm going to start with just a reflection. I think, Mr. Mosana, what you were talking about, Marxist conceptualizations of the state, and I think it's an important point that I perhaps left out here because one can't fit everything in, but if you're thinking about the state being an instrument of the dominant classes, then it still brings us back to the conversation around how do we avoid then having only a certain set of elites who are in the space to influence the state and to direct the state. And how does that weaken the state? I don't think that is necessarily something that we can unpack fully here, but I think that when we're talking about that, and then and just feeding into what Mr. Fikisi was saying, whose role, or you were saying whose role it is to muster up civil society to, take responsibility for collective action, to hold the state accountable. Here, we're not even now talking about, for example, the role of parliaments and their particular role in representation, for example. So sometimes I think it's a function of what you were saying, how the state is, how ideology, first of all, sets up the state, and then how the bureaucratic machinery responds to that. So even when we're talking about, for example, the entrepreneurial state. So, Mariana might be talking about a certain theoretically, pure way in which it must unfold or manifest. But then it is subservient to the dominant ideology of the existing state. And then if we're talking about the entrepreneurial state, who are the actors who are going to be privileged in those spaces to be able to have the ear of government or of the state, or to have the agency that, enables them for wealth creation. And that then creates further inequalities. An example is, I think Singapore is going through quite a hard time right now with their levels of inequality. From what I read, the issue is around, for example, meritocracy, where they pushed, I would say, sort of some type of entrepreneurial state, and they pushed really, meritocratic principles of whether it was private sector or public sector development, but that created further inequalities within the system. And so they are struggling now with ideologically where they stand as a developmental state. Do they focus now on, for example, so exactly what I was saying earlier on this bifurcation between economic policy and social policy? There is this contestation that if we focus on industrial policy, we focus on economic growth, it's going to trickle down. Everybody will, be lifted by the rising tide. But over and over, we see it only lasts for a particular period of time, and then, problems of inequality prevail. So it's just a roundabout way of saying that, yes, Marxist conceptualizations of the state are very useful as an analytical model, because it actually takes us right back to the question around how should the state behave towards non-state actors. And unfortunately, in post-colonial African states, I think we as South Africa, it's a little bit better actually, because a lot of post-independent African states were at the behest of Bretton Woods institutions, structural adjustment programs. Even right now, some of the public good programs, for example, health is wholly funded by donors, for example. So they are almost completely at the hands and the mercy of these dominant models of what a democracy should look like. So even the bureaucratic machinery must, conform to that. I think in South Africa, we have more room and more space, and we should grab it. We should actually say, well, we are not at the behest of anybody else externally. Yes, we are part of globalization is real, but we still have agency to direct ourselves and to have an ideological position that says to our citizens, we do want an inclusive society. We want to have formations that really does establish these close relations with citizens, of course, in organized formations. The last point, just in response to what Andile, what you were saying about there's a false homogeneity among civil society. That's, the kind of infighting. My research actually revealed that, and maybe you and I can have a discussion around it if you're interested. But really, some negative things came out in terms of how disorganized and chaotic civil society is currently, and the issue around some organizations who are highly funded by international donors, for example, actually withhold data from government currently, because they say, you paying us only 500,000 for our services, we getting $2 million from whoever, so you will get 500,000 rands worth of my data. I'm not joking. This is it's not a parody. This is exactly what one particular organization said. We only provide government with 500,000 rands worth of the data because that's what they're funding us for. So this, and that kind of attitude then distances some organizations from poorer ones who have to kind of acquiesce to government systems and government bureaucracy and are not as free and that don't have as much agency because they don't have funding. So they, for example, in M&E get inundated with requests for reports, etc., because all their funding comes from the state. So there's a lot of threads to this that, we can go into, but we don't have time for. But let me stop there, Chair. Thank you.
Colleagues, that was really good. I don't know if there's any absolute last points that anyone may want to make before I make some concluding remarks and just maybe share a way forward. Can I just see by show of hands, is everyone covered? I don't see any hands. Colleagues, I think you'll agree with me. This is the kind of stimulating debate and really rich debate that we really need. We sometimes get so bogged down in running processes and projects and implementation that we forget our theoretical roots. And Candice, I think you've really kind of awoken a lot of thoughts in our minds. And thank you very, very, very much for that. I think there's a huge number of lot of reflection as an organization, as ECSECC, and I think maybe all of the other colleagues that are sitting here that we would have to do. I think issues such as are we really dealing with we use Westphalian models and we use Weberian models which build states that extract. There may be a place for us to use maybe what you've started here today to start a discourse around, but how do we authentically, should we not have our own new theory of how to develop a state and not necessarily utilize and a kind of an indigenous idea of the state? And I also think that maybe going forward, we've developed some fantastic, together with UNDP, scenarios for the province. And maybe at some point we need to bring these together and say, but what are the implications of what you've been saying to this? Colleagues, thank you very much. ECSECC, as you know, we're really committed to not just developing the, trying to understand problems. Our purpose is also to help solve the problems, and I think it's very important to reach out and form the kind of partnerships with Candice and with everybody out there. So in the future, colleagues, the way forward is, I think internally we will obviously reflect quite a lot on this topic and have some substantive debate about it. Candice, we will definitely extend an invitation to you to come and maybe engage in a little bit more detail. Colleagues, we are at that time of the year where everybody's going off to holiday. Please enjoy your holiday, rest, think about all these debates and these topics. And next year, we've got some really, really exciting topics also in the pipeline for you. So please stay tuned. Please watch out for any emails coming from ECSECC. Colleagues, with that, I really want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time and for participating and being part of this really, really stimulating debate. Thank you, colleagues. The meeting is adjourned. Thanks. Colleagues, I see Mr. Musana is still there.
Sybert. No. I was raising my hand as a real pondo to thank the one who has thanked everyone. Thanks to you, and thanks again, Candice. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ta-ta.
Bye.